draws his red line. That was the headline today in a leading Russian newspaper. Speaking in St. Petersburg, the Russian president sent a clear warning to the West. Do not allow Ukraine to use your long-range missiles to strike Russian territory. Moscow would view that as the direct participation of NATO countries in the war in Ukraine. It would substantially change the very essence and nature of the conflict. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European states are fighting with Russia, he said. Putin's argument is this. For missile launches into Russia, Ukraine would require data from Western satellites, and that only servicemen from NATO member states would be able to input flight missions into these missile systems. On many occasions in the past, the Russian president has been accused of issuing threats to the West and engaging in nuclear saber-rattling. Since the Ukraine war began in February 2022, the West has provided Ukraine with tanks, advanced missile systems, and most recently F-16 American fighter jets. This year, Russia has already accused Ukraine of using American long-range ATACMS missiles to target Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula annexed by Russia. But from the tone of President Putin's latest remark, it is clear he believes the targeting of internationally recognized Russian territory with Western missile systems would take the conflict to a new level. However, he has not spelled out how Moscow would respond to such an eventuality. Putin said, "We will take corresponding decisions based on the threats to us that will be created." Now, in the month of June, at a meeting with the heads of international news agencies, Putin was asked how would Russia react if Ukraine was given the opportunity to hit targets inside Russian territory with weapons supplied by Europe. Here's how Putin replied. First, we will of course improve our air defense systems. We will be destroying their missiles. Second, we believe that if someone is thinking it is possible to supply such weapons to a war zone to strike our territory and create problems for us, why can't we supply our weapons of the same class to those regions around the world where they will target sensitive facilities of the countries that are doing this to Russia? In other words, arming Western adversaries to strike Western targets abroad is something that Moscow has been considering. Earlier this month, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov announced that Russia was set to revise its nuclear doctrine, the document that lays out under what circumstances Moscow may consider using nuclear weapons. He said the decision to revise the doctrine was connected with the escalation course of Russia's Western adversaries. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Washington for talks with President Joe Biden. Among the issues the two leaders are expected to discuss is the question of Ukraine and long-range missiles. On his way to Washington, Starmer said, "Russia started this conflict. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. Russia can end this conflict straight away. Western leaders will need to decide what is more important, the risk of escalation of this conflict or the need to lift restrictions on Ukraine's use of Western missiles." Why has Putin issued this threat to the West now? And what are these long-range missiles that he is referring to? Recent media reports stated that the United Kingdom, a key NATO member, has cleared Ukraine's use of the Storm Shadow cruise missile to target Russian territories. For a while now, President Zelensky has indicated that Ukraine plans to change its war strategy with the use of long-range cruise missiles targeting deep inside Russian territory. Ukraine already has the Storm Shadow missile, but it uses it only within its own territory to combat Russian forces. The Storm Shadow is a low observable, long-range air-launched cruise missile. It is jointly developed by the UK and France and has a range of around 500 kilometers. It has already been integrated into Ukrainian fighter aircraft. How the export of such long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine was permitted is unclear, as the Missile Technology Control Regime, or MTCR, which the UK is a founding member of, restricts the export of missiles that have a range longer than 300 kilometers and a payload capacity of 500 kilos. However, the MTCR is an informal political understanding between member states, and its regulations are not always binding. The question now is, if Ukraine gets the go-ahead to use cruise missiles to attack Russian territory, will Moscow consider the use of nuclear weapons? As we mentioned, the Kremlin has already blamed the collective actions of the West in Ukraine for Russia revising its nuclear doctrine. Without revealing what the changes might be, Moscow has said that certain changes are required to be made on the policy of the circumstances for the use of its nukes. And these developments come at a time when India is trying to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine. India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval met President Putin on Thursday and reportedly carried a peace plan sent by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In the last 2 months, Prime Minister Modi has visited both Russia and Ukraine and told the leaders of the two countries that India is ready to play an active role in every effort to restore peace in Ukraine. India is in a unique position as a country that has friendly ties with both the warring nations. Putin has stated that India, along with China and Brazil, can mediate in the conflict. And Zelensky has suggested that India can host the Second Peace Summit on the Ukraine war. Meanwhile, Russia has expelled 6 British diplomats, accusing them of subversive activities and threatening Russia's security. In other words, they've been accused of spying and sabotage. The FSB, Russia's spy agency, has claimed that it possesses documents proving that a department within the British Foreign Office in London was involved in coordinating efforts to escalate both political and military tensions. This department was tasked with ensuring Russia's defeat in its conflict with Ukraine, says the FSB.
It is not about allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is about making a decision about whether NATO countries are directly involved in the military conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing less than the direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, and European countries in the war in Ukraine. This is their direct participation, and this, of course, significantly changes the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are fighting Russia. And if this is so, then, bearing in mind the change in the very essence of this conflict, we will make appropriate decisions based on the threats that will be created for us.
Well, so where is the Russia-Ukraine conflict going? What does this latest warning from President Putin to the West really mean? To decipher that, we're joined on Global Lens tonight by Dr. Arvind Gupta, former Deputy National Security Advisor of India, Professor Umu Salma Bawa, who teaches at the Center for European Studies at the School of International Studies at JNU, Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, security and geopolitical expert, and in a moment, we are going to be joined by Pathikrit Payne, foreign affairs analyst. Before I throw this open to my panel, I need to take a quick break on Global Lens, but don't go anywhere. We'll have this conversation on the other side.
Fast.
My God, isn't she your daughter?
Yes.
She's playing football. This is boys' game. Make her study. If she doesn't get a good job, she will get a good match. Will you win the world by playing football?
Yes, auntie. My daughter will win the world by playing football.
Let's go to Germany.
World's largest football talent hunt, News9 Indian Tigers and Tigresses, in association with DFB Pokal, Bundesliga, BBB and India Football Center. Train and play matches in Europe. Register now and fly to Germany. IndianTigersandTigresses.com.
How do you fulfill that promise? Because ultimately expectations have to be met. If you look at the political landscape, is it really changing for women? And what is the inability of the forces that dead bodies surface but not the living people?
And Muktiwani Yoda, who was aide to Sheikh Mujib, came to my CEO. I told him that the family of Sheikh Mujib is under captivity of the Pakistani forces. The first lady came with Sheikh Mujib and she embraced me and said, the God, the Allah has sent you to save us. Modi ji and the Hasina. During talk, she brought out this point again that Major Ashok Taraf Indian Army said me, my mother, my sister, my brother, we got independent on 17th December because of Ashok Taraf.
This and more. Streaming on News9 plus news is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and we are discussing Russian President Vladimir Putin's latest threat to the West. Let's go across to our panel of experts. Dr. Arvind Gupta, if I could begin with you. Vladimir Putin says to the West, do not allow Ukraine to use your long-range missiles to strike Russian territory. If they do that, that would change the essence and nature of the ongoing conflict. And that would essentially mean that NATO, the United States and European states are pretty much at war with Russia. How seriously are the Western countries likely to view this threat from Putin? And how likely are they to actually give Ukraine the go-ahead to use their long-range missiles to strike targets inside Russian territory? As we speak, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Washington to hold talks with the US President, and whether to give Ukraine such permission is one of the issues that tops his agenda.
Well, this is not going to be a very easy decision for NATO countries to give permission to Ukraine to strike with these missiles deep into the territory of Russia. Because as Putin has said, and I think he is serious about it, the complexion of the conflict will change very drastically. So far, NATO has supplied weapons, but it has not got directly involved in the war. So I think Putin is serious in what he's saying, but so far, perhaps at least in the public domain, it's not very clear as to how the complexion of the war might change. Even for Russia to take on NATO directly, I mean, that is what this statement means, that this would be a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. But what would be the implications of that decision if it takes on NATO countries directly? This will not be easy even for Russia. So I would say at this point of time, perhaps this is posturing, but the situation is very dangerous and it could escalate into something bigger. And as we can see from the recent statements of Zelensky, he is putting a lot of pressure on his NATO countries, US and others, who to make Russia pay.
Okay, we've lost the line there to Dr. Arvind Gupta, but let me take this question to Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni. General Kulkarni, I have two questions for you. First and foremost, how seriously does the West need to view Putin's threat? He says, if you allow Ukraine to use your long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russian territory, it will mean NATO is directly at war with Russia. Now, some might say that would practically be World War III. Nobody can afford to see such an escalation. And number two, so if you could explain to our viewers, what are these Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles that we are talking about, which Ukraine already is in possession of?
Thank you, Neha. At the very outset, well, it's a new red line. The West seems to know that Mr. Putin draws red lines, and somehow or the other, the West continues to equip Ukraine with all that it can. It has the tanks, it has the aircrafts, it has the drones, it has the air defense systems. So all said and done, the Russians are aware that something which they could have well done it in 30 days has lasted over 3 years, and one doesn't know how long it will continue. And therefore, for the Russians, anything that is being fired at them, whether it is on the eastern frontier or even on the outskirts of Moscow, it's all being equipped by the West. There's nothing that Ukraine is manufacturing. All its manufacturing and all of it is gone. So what is there that Ukraine has of its own? Nothing. Virtually nothing. Everything, entire arsenal being equipped. The Ukrainians are being equipped. It's only the soldiers, I would say, they are fighting. And that also one really doesn't know. But having given that, yes, now what the Russians seem to be telling in no uncertain terms, and primarily Mr. Putin, with the kind of emphasis and the kind of attitude and the kind of, the warning being given to the West as not to use those long-range missiles, which the Ukrainians are already equipped with. They're already firing all those in Crimea. They are already using those on the Black Sea Fleet. It isn't that. But all that is perceived by the West as their territory. The Russians may be in occupation of almost 20% of the Ukrainian territory, which the Russians claim to be theirs, but to the West, all of it is still Ukraine, and therefore the Ukrainians are using all the missiles that have been given to the Ukrainians, and they're firing on the Russians. Now, at this point of time, well, what you rightly said, the way he was asked as to what would you do if they were to use long-range missiles, and he was honest enough to say, I would first use the air defense system. I will ensure that, all of it, I will also give it in equipped countries which are, anti-West, and see to it that how West can be destroyed with the kind of missiles that the Russians would be supplying to the enemies of the West. And of course, the nuclear doctrine change. If that be so, because Russia does have a sizable amount, or in fact the largest amount of nuclear missiles, they wouldn't want to use them. But if forced, as I said, because that is why this entire war, the equipping the Ukrainians was to ensure that its territory is not sort of captured by the Russians. But Russia has already done it. In that context, probably Mr. Putin seems to feel that maybe the West might consent using these missiles to Ukraine. And now, like this, we're talking about the Storm Shadow, range approximately about 250 kilometers, even going up to, as you said, up to 500. But no, it is approximately about 250 kilometers, because the American tactical missile systems are up to about 300 kilometers. All of them are very expensive, almost $1 million cost one missile. It hugs the terrain, and it almost can be fired from an aircraft which is flying at the speed of sound. So it has a tremendous advantage. It can go as close within the Ukrainian territory and probably launch missiles which are even 250, 300 kilometers deep into the Russian territory. Having lost Kursk, that portion approximately about 1,500 square kilometers, obviously the Russians do feel that, if the West allows this kind of a thing, which I hope with the American elections now in November and the things that are being said, if Trump was to come to power, or if Kamala Harris was to come to power, depending upon how things change, how the Americans also seem to be feeling that, yes, too much of equipping it also seems very, very difficult now. Somewhere it does give a feeling. Zelensky also seems to feel, and virtually threatening its allied partners, that if you are not to equip us, we would rather surrender and we give it up. Now the Ukrainians are fighting the war on behalf of the West against Russia. Russia knows the very fact Russia has sustained itself for so long is indicative that yes, it also has a limit, and therefore the new red line, whether whether these missiles can and will, obviously if the missiles with a range of 300 kilometers plus being fired from aircraft which are at the speed of sound, can hit anywhere close to Moscow. So that is where the red line is, and I personally feel the West wouldn't allow, but Mr. Putin is prepared to defend Russia and has warned the West that should that happen, he will not hesitate to use whatever he has. He hasn't specified what, but he can use even the nuclear.
And the threat of him pushing the nuclear button is always hanging over the West, isn't it? Let me,
Yes.
and you know, it's interesting you talk about the US election. Well, if you ask Trump, he says, I will end this conflict in 24 hours. And we all know it will not be on terms favorable to Ukraine. But let me take this to Professor Bava. Professor Bava, some skeptics say that over the course of the last 2.5 years since this war began in February of 2022, Vladimir Putin has drawn multiple red lines, and on multiple occasions the West has gone ahead and crossed those red lines. But do you believe that this particular red line is different? This is a threat that the West is likely to take more seriously? Putin says, you allow Kiev to use your long-range missiles against us inside our territory. It is all-out war. Like I said, in other words, World War III. Therefore, how do you think the West would view this threat? Keeping in mind that there is, of course, tremendous pressure from President Zelensky for permission from the Western nations for Kiev to go ahead and actually use these long-range missiles inside Russian territory.
So, good evening, Neha, and thank you for having me on the panel. I think it's important to recognize that every red line is a standalone by itself because it is in a particular context. And you could put all of them together and see, okay, what does it produce as the outcome? I think very clearly the viewers recognize it's 2.5 years since the war has started. Europe is headed already early into an early winter. And, conditions will change extremely soon. And that is one important factor to keep in mind. Second, both sides, there is a certain element of fatigue, and there's also recognition the strategy needs to change to at least, capture and hold what they have, or at least retain the level of success in terms of strategic capturing and holding on the ground. So it is in this context, the kind of military strategy, the weapons available, their ability to deploy, change the war narrative, and produce action on the ground becomes extremely important. One has to also recognize that this war in Ukraine, while it has local ramifications, if you were to localize it, that it is between Russia and Ukraine, let's not forget that it is tied into much larger global, issues and connections. And that is now the backdrop within which it is taking place. First, that within the US, US is heading in the next few months into election, the presidential election. This may be among one of the last few decisions in terms of foreign policy for President Biden. So that's also important to, wait and watch what comes out of the meeting today between President Biden and British Prime Minister Starmer. That's going to be extremely important. Let's not forget that while the West has equipped Ukraine with weapons, it is Ukraine which is fighting the war. I think that's important to underline over here. Ukraine has benefited from all the support in terms of military, logistics, and intelligence that the West has provided. Now, war can and will produce, very different kind of partnerships and intended and unintended consequences, which is what one is witnessing over here. If one is focusing on the fact that today Britain perhaps has given, we don't have very clear indications on permission to use Storm Shadow missiles, in Russian territory. There is also news reports that Iran has equipped Russia with missiles. So does that mean that that also brings Iran into the war with the West? These are questions which also need to be put on the table and not just make it a binary that, where Russia or President Putin is saying that this deployment of missiles, long-range missiles, and the permission to use within Russia would change the rules of engagement in the war. I think it also needs to be balanced out with looking at, okay, what is happening on the countries which are also now equipping Russia with missiles? How does that bring those countries, specifically China and Iran, into this larger conflict then with the West that is taking place? That's the first point. Second, as you correctly pointed out, many red lines have been drawn. Will this be a game changer? Yes and no. I think one would have to see as to what will be, first the decision coming out of Washington itself. Second, if you take that Crimea is held by Russia today, and there is already the use of Western weapons in that, then what changes, right? So is Crimea no longer Russian territory that Putin overlooks, or Putin makes a distinction between Crimea and the rest of Russia? That would be very important. That means already, if Western weapons are already being used in Crimea, then why is it that you've not had the kind of escalation which is seeing now? So at this point, it is a verbal escalation, one can put it and say. It's also about testing the mettle. It's also about testing and seeing how strong will be the Western, kind of alliance and framework, as the politics in Washington will rapidly shift towards a president who is on his way out, and it will, in the intervening period, create a vacuum in terms of what can politically come out of Washington. That will be important as we head into the next few months of this year and into winter, where then fighting will become extremely difficult. So I think it will be important to balance and see, and you've already seen that escalation take place with Russia saying that, okay, these British diplomats have to leave, they've been part of espionage. But look at the timing. They've already left a month back. So I think one has to look at the larger optics of politics, strategy militarily on the ground. And okay, even if a permission for use comes, do they actually get used? So listen, there is a difference between
Zelensky is dying to use them. The question is, will the permission come? You've made a series of very important points. How does Putin view the use of these missiles inside Crimea? Is that not a red line that's been crossed if he believes Crimea is Russian territory? And as for the involvement of players such as Iran, well, it is certainly interesting, but I think it would be safe to say that Iran is a country that in a sense lurks in the shadows, whether it is its role vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine war or even the Israel-Hamas war for that matter. But the larger question still remains, what is the West going to do? Is this an issue that could cause a very serious escalation? Given the war fatigue that we see around the globe today, would that be a wise move on part of the West to give Zelensky the go-ahead for something like this? We'll examine that in greater detail on the other side of this short break. Stay with us.
Hey, careful, huh? My daddy got it from abroad. Hey, disaster! How will you pay for the loss now?
In stock market, you should take risk as per your capacity and knowledge. Trade in options very carefully.
Wow, Dikra! Absolutely perfect. Take risk with full understanding.
Invest kar. This is News9 Live, India's only digital exclusive live stream. For the early adopters, bringing you the news 24/7. For the smart audiences on the smartest TVs. News9 Live. Stream now on your smart TVs.
Narendra Damodar Das Modi. Terrorism always flows like water. It will go in the direction where there is no obstacle.
Bloodbath in Jammu. 5 soldiers die after terrorists open fire at an army convoy in Kathua.
Pakistan essentially is doing is opening a new frontier in the Jammu region.
This and more. Streaming on News9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and we're discussing Russia's new red line in its ongoing conflict with Ukraine. Let me go back to my panelists. Dr. Arvind Gupta, let me come to you now. Since it is impossible to read Putin's mind and none of us have a crystal ball, all we can do is speculate. So let me ask you this question. If hypothetically, let's say the United Kingdom were to give Ukraine permission to use its Storm Shadow missiles inside Russian territory, how far do you think Putin is likely to go in his response to that provocation? Could he in fact push the nuclear button? He's of course been accused of indulging in nuclear saber-rattling many times in the past, but could such an eventuality actually create a very serious situation of a nuclear threat? In the month of June, one of the things that he suggested was that Moscow could even consider arming Western adversaries to strike Western targets abroad if they gave such permission to Kiev.
I think it is premature to talk about the nuclear button. As we have seen in so many conflicts around the world, when nuclear powers are involved, there are many options in between. And there would be a series of responses the military planners on the Russian side would have already thought about the use of how to respond to this specific scenario. So I think this will be not correct that a missile is used, long-range missile is used, and suddenly there is a nuclear button is pressed. So that is not correct. But yes, as military planners, I'm sure they would have many options worked out, and much will depend upon what is the ground situation at that point of time, what is the Russian preparedness, and what are the Western preparedness. So I think there are many factors involved here, and as Professor Baba pointed out, there are many global factors, regional factors at play. So it is not just a Russia-Ukraine war. You see, it has been a proxy war between Russia and NATO for the last 2 years. As you have also pointed out, it's the NATO equipment, about $100 billion worth of NATO equipment has been given to Ukraine. Out of that, about 58 billion is from the US itself, and a whole wide range of equipment is already being used, etc. But I think what has changed in the last few months is the sudden Ukrainian thrust into Kursk. And they're occupying something like some 1,1600 square kilometers of territory, which has put Russia on the back foot. And it has also hardened the Russian stance. So I think the recent statements that are coming out of Moscow and Putin particularly is a reaction to that. So they will have to work on getting Kursk vacated, and I think that is where a lot of focus will be, but it is not going to be easy. So as I said, a lot of posturing will happen, but in the end, it is the military plans and the military assessments on both sides that will decide as to what next will happen. But talking of nuclear at this stage is, I think, premature.
The nuclear threat, but there could certainly be a serious escalation. You mentioned, the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, putting Russia on the back foot. Well, equally, Russia making significant gains in Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine has come as a setback to Kiev. But either way, the war has only escalated in recent weeks. Let me bring in Pathikrit Payne, who now joins us on Global Lens. Pathikrit, the question that we are discussing tonight is simply this. Putin has set a new red line. How likely is the West to cross this red line and give Kiev permission to use its long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russian territory? And if they do that, would that be serious trouble for the entire world? Would that lead to very serious escalation and a very dangerous situation that nobody wants?
No, good evening, Neha. No, first of all, I don't believe that nobody wants that escalation. NATO actually is looking for that escalation. Washington actually is looking for an escalation. The only people who are not looking for that escalation are the countries in the Eastern Europe. Today, I think Finland made it very clear that they are not into it. They will not use their base for attacking Russia. There are protests in Netherlands that why is Netherlands giving the F-16s, 24 of them to Ukraine, because this is not their war. Yes, yesterday I think Blinken and Mr. Lammy, who is the foreign minister, I think, or defense minister of UK, they went to Ukraine, they went to Kyiv, they used the same train that Modi ji used, and I think the discussion was all about these long-range missiles. Now, if the American thought process is this, that by giving these long-range missiles, Russia will succumb, then I think they need to read a little better in terms of history and geopolitics, because this is only going to escalate matters. It will not lead to something nuclear, but I think then Russia will not mind crossing the borders of Ukraine and hitting some of the countries which are part of NATO. And so the first casualties will be the Eastern European countries, who are today feeling pretty jittery. And I don't think today either Zelensky or anyone else in that area is taking decisions. Decisions are being taken from Brussels. Decisions are being taken from Washington. Zelensky is a pawn, and the previous panelist rightfully mentioned that this is a proxy war going on. If the escalation continues, then I think by the next year, this time, we would not be discussing the potential possibility of a European conflict. We would be discussing the European conflict that would be going on by that time. I think they cannot just, press the Control-Alt-Del button and think that they can delete Russia like that. They have to understand that Russia plays a role in Europe, the Eurasian region, and they need to accept it. If they don't accept it, and they're not accepting, the war has gone on for far too long. I think if any country in our vicinity thinks of attacking us with long-range missiles, then India would rightfully do the needful in terms of reciprocation, not just against the country which is firing the weapons, but also the countries who are supplying the weapons. And mind you, Ukraine is not buying these weapons. Ukraine is being provided these weapons free of cost, which means somebody wants this war to be fought by Ukraine, and those somebody are those who don't want a frontal, direct fight with Russia. But eventually, if it continues, if common sense does not come back in the headquarters of NATO, that this is all leading towards destruction and devastation, then merely blaming India, or Prime Minister Modi, why he went and hugged President Putin, is not going to solve the problems of Europe. Europe is in deep crisis today, and I think Europe must introspect that the missiles of Russia will not reach Washington, but it would invariably reach the capitals of some of the European countries. Are they prepared for a war? I seriously doubt their condition in terms of economy, in terms of the social chaos, in terms of their energy crisis, which is again because they were traditionally centered and dependent on Russia for energy, and today they have imposed sanctions on Russia, because of which the price of energy in most of the European countries have gone up by 10 times. And they are supplying weapons to Ukraine to hit the same Russia from which oil comes to them. So I think today the only thing that is needed is common sense. It is totally lacking both in Brussels and Washington.
Okay, we need common sense, which is lacking at the moment. I'm out of time, but Professor Bava, I'll give you the last word as we wrap up this discussion tonight. These developments and the verbal escalation, as you put it, come at a time when India is trying very hard to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine and engaging in some sort of shuttle diplomacy. Our national security advisor met with President Putin, reportedly carrying a message and a peace plan from Prime Minister Modi. Both Russia and Ukraine have acknowledged that India does have a role in restoration of peace in the region. I think a lot of other countries, including the United States, are also taking sort of recognition of that fact. But really, given the way the war is going at the moment, what are the odds that India can actually play a constructive and meaningful role in, at the very least, bringing the temperatures down and bringing the two sides to the negotiating table in the capacity of an interlocutor?
So I think India's role becomes even more, defining when, the temperatures are so high, when you see that there is the provocation for escalation is available extremely soon. I think all efforts which seek to at least bring some kind of sanity, within the different countries involved is extremely important. First point. Second, I think as Prime Minister has reiterated, the era of war is over, but war is staring in our face, not in one, but in multiple arenas. And India, with its long diplomatic history and engagement with the region, is perhaps one of those few countries which is today in a position to be able to talk to both sides, a choice which is not there with the West at this point. And I think to that extent, I think India carries tremendous global goodwill in being the ambassador of peace and in being the ambassador for dialogue and diplomacy, as the Prime Minister has reiterated. So I think it's critical that whatever opportunity is available, every country or every interlocutor will take. And in recent times, as you spoke about, Neha, the shuttle diplomacy clearly underscores that there is a sense of urgency, and that urgency is about how to, contain what is first a verbal provocation, and second, to contain actions which should not lead to irreversible consequences of escalating the war and creating further new fault lines. So I think to that extent, whatever effort India takes is going to be important, will be welcome. And I think everybody is also closely following how India will take it forward. It's probably one step forward, two steps back. But if nobody is going to put that one step forward, it's only going to be steps backward. And I think to that extent, India's diplomatic initiatives are something which I think is extremely important.
And they've been welcomed, no doubt about it. And you're right in making the point that India has a lot of global goodwill today and can, in fact, be trusted to act as an honest peace broker. The question really is Putin willing to listen? Is Zelensky willing to listen? And is the United States serious? Are all these parties serious about truly ending the war that has now gone on for far too long? On that note, Dr. Arvind Gupta, Professor Bawa, Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni and Pathikrit, thank you so much to all of you for joining me on Global Lens tonight. All right, let's now shift our focus to neighboring China and the border dispute between the two countries. Highlighting that troops have disengaged at 4 places in eastern Ladakh, including Galwan Valley, the Chinese Foreign Ministry today said India and China have agreed during their meeting in Russia to work together to create conditions for the improvement of bilateral relations. India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held talks on the sidelines of a meeting of the BRICS high-ranking officials responsible for security matters in St. Petersburg in Russia on Thursday, where they discussed the progress made in the recent consultations on border issues. That's what the Chinese Foreign Ministry said in a press release today. Asked whether the two countries were close to a breakthrough to revive their bilateral ties that have been frozen for over 4 years due to the military standoff in eastern Ladakh, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said the two militaries realized disengagement in 4 areas and the situation along the border is stable. Mao said, and I quote,